Hey everybody, I'm here today with Sean McCarthy. Sean is a comedian and co-host of the Grubstakers podcast. And Sean has very kindly agreed to come on my channel today to talk about a topic that I'm very interested in, but also pretty ignorant in, which is the GameStop situation and the Wall Street story that has been happening the past couple weeks. So I'll just start by saying why I'm interested in this topic, which is that it seems to me after the sort of huge transfer of wealth that we saw during coronavirus, where regular people lost out, regular Americans lost money, lost jobs, and billionaires just got richer. It seems like this is something where regular people have figured out a way to take back some of that wealth and sort of fuck with Wall Street. So to start with, Sean, could you just, I guess, what's the case for why we would want to fuck with Wall Street? What's sort of, if these Redditors could tell us, like, why do they want to do this? What's the goal here in messing with Wall Street?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's good to be somebody explaining the stock market who just lost money on it. So you've got a real expert here.
Okay.
Only a few $100s. But in terms of like why people would want to mess with Wall Street, it's just how much time do you got, basically. But what I could run you through is, going back to the 1980s, we saw deregulation of a lot of what was put in place during the New Deal after Wall Street caused the Great Depression in this country. And that deregulation has caused a series of rolling financial crises and bailouts that have been occurring going all the way back to the savings and loans crisis, and then the dot-com bubble, which was really a pump and dump kind of scam by Wall Street on average retail investors. They paid fines for this. And then, of course, you go up until the 2008 financial crisis, which a lot of people kind of misunderstand, and they just most of the stories that are told about it are just people in big buildings in New York City, lost some money, and that's kind of the focus of it. But if you read, I really recommend the book Chain of Title by David Dayen. It talks about the real story of 2008 was the foreclosure crisis. About 10 million Americans lost their homes in 2008, and the vast majority of these foreclosures were completely illegal. Going back to British or English property law, basically the way a property sale is supposed to work is that you're supposed to be able to show in public registers that the chain of title, that it was sold to this person and then to this person and then to this person throughout the entire history. But what happened with the mortgage-backed securities in 2008 is they were just bounced around these financial institutions, dozens or hundreds or thousands of times. And the actual information as to who owns what was held on this system that was internal to these banks called MERS. And this was like a completely closed, non-public system. So what they had to do, and this is where all this term robo-signing comes from, is they had to just create these documents out of thin air to foreclose on people. So these totally illegal documents submitted to the courts, and then they just paid a big fine and they got away with it. And the Obama administration essentially legalized what they did. So 10 million people lost their homes, and the vast majority of that was completely illegal. So, and plenty of people lost their livelihoods, lost everything in 2008. So you just kind of build all that up to today, where they got away with it. They just paid a slap on the wrist fine. Nobody went to jail. Everybody still has all their money, and they're still manipulating the markets today, which brings you up to the GameStop story, where some users on the Reddit and some other people noticed that GameStop had been short sold, which I can explain if you'd like me to. But basically, to short sell a stock is to bet that the price of it is going to go down. And you do that by you borrow a share and you immediately sell it, and then you buy it back later with the expectation that because the price went down, your profit is the difference between what it was initially and what you buy it back for. And that's totally fine. That's a part of the stock market. But another thing that was outlawed after 2008, in terms of the minor changes that we got, was there was a law passed against naked short selling. And naked short selling is essentially when you don't actually borrow the share, like you just pretend you borrowed the share. So you just essentially create a share out of thin air and then sell it and then buy it back later. And as long as the price goes down, you get away with this. But if the price doesn't go down, this creates problems. And so again, naked short selling is illegal. And what some of these Redditors noticed is that GameStop had something like 50 million shares outstanding, but about 140% of those shares were short sold. So, and there's some loopholes and some other explanations that people will point to and say, oh, that doesn't prove that there was naked short selling. But you can also look at what's called failed to deliver, which is a SEC that keeps track of. I mentioned, you have to return the shares after you borrow it and then sell it. You have to be able to have the physical shares. And these numbers that the SEC keeps track of the failures to deliver showed in December something like 1.7 million failed to deliver shares. I believe first half of January was 1.6. I might be wrong on that number, but a significant number of these shares just didn't exist. So I think there was a lot of evidence of illegal stock manipulation in GameStop. And what these people figured out was that if there are more shares shorted than actually physically exist, then what you can do, or a collective group of people can do, is start buying up shares and just hold on to them and refuse to sell them. And eventually the short sellers are going to have to return the shares, buy back the shares when their short contract expires. And if there's, again, more shorts than there are shares that actually exist, the price could theoretically go infinite as long as everybody just holds on to their shares. So they did all that. And then last week, you saw the price of GameStop stock go up 400% in 1 week. It peaked at about $480. And then you've got this really insane situation where all these retail brokerages, which the people were using to buy their shares, such as Robinhood, TD Ameritrade, Charles Schwab, all of them just shut off the buy side of the trade. And they said, you can only sell this stock. You can't buy it anymore. And obviously that's going to push the price down. And, this is Wednesday, February 3rd. So far, it looks like it has worked. We'll see if it does in future, but it is just something where on that particular Thursday, nobody can really take back what happened, but I think the price would have gone up a lot more than it actually did had these restrictions not been put in place. And I think the Redditors and everybody who invested in this has a big right to be angry, because these brokerages apps that all shut down the buy side of the trade, they make most of their money working with these hedge funds and these clearinghouses that were short, or at least heavily invested or had a big financial interest in the people who were short of this stock. So it does seem like there was a lot of conflicted incentives for the people who made those decisions to shut down the buy side of this trade.
Mm-hmm. And did they make any statement about why they did that? I mean, was there any legitimate reason for them to do that?
Yeah, so Robinhood's got the most attention of this. The CEO, Vlad something or other, he went on CNBC and he said that they had to do it for financial reasons. But then he was asked by Andrew Ross Sorkin of CNBC, does that mean there's a liquidity problem? And then he said, no, there's no liquidity problem. Because of course, if you run a business and you say there's a liquidity problem, that makes it very hard to get more money into your business. So you can't say that. And you can't say that there was any sort of coordination with your big customers, the people who give you your big revenue, because that would be pretty illegal. So essentially he's like said it was a money problem, but at the same time said it's not a money problem. And it might have been a money problem, but then if it was a money problem, well, TD Ameritrade, Charles Schwab, Cash App, all these Webull, all these different brokerages all just happen to have the same money problem all at the same time, only on the buy side. Like if it was a money problem legitimately, the smart thing to me seems like just shut down the buy and the sell side and then recapitalize and then go from there. But when you only give people the option to sell a security, that's going to push the price down.
Mm-hmm. And can you explain a little bit more about why, I guess, so as someone who's completely new to all this, I'm just trying to figure it all out. And, I guess, can you explain a little bit more about why some people are buying and some people are selling? So what's the difference kind of between the demographics? You've got like the big guys on Wall Street, and then you've got the little guys on Reddit or wherever. What's kind of the different angles that they're coming at this from?
Yeah, well, with GameStop specifically, the short sellers who predicted it would go down, a lot of them are hedge funds who have just made the calculation that retail is dead. Everything's going to move online. Nobody's going to shop in stores anymore. And then on the Reddit side, I think people had different reasons for buying, but I do think the identification that there was more than 120 or 140% short interest in this particular stock was a very compelling reason to buy, because it does present a situation where the short sellers had seriously overextended themselves, and a profit could be made there. Though some people do believe that GameStop was undervalued. I don't think anybody thinks it would have been valued at 480 a share, but maybe it was at $4. Maybe a lot of people did think that that was too low, probably correctly.
Mm-hmm. So how did the people organize to drive this stock up? There's this WallStreetBets on Reddit. And can you tell us a little bit about that, and what's the culture like? How did these people actually end up banding together to do this?
Yeah, so WallStreetBets is a Reddit board. Its description is like 4chan found a Bloomberg terminal. So I think that gives you a pretty good idea of the culture, in that it's kind of mostly young men who come from this kind of 4chan culture of anonymous shit posting, of just talking shit on the internet, kind of venting steam, with all that is inherent in that kind of behavior. But in terms of demographics, I haven't studied it too extensively, but from what I can tell, just based on the typical 4chan user, it's usually a person in their 20s or 30s who's more often than not male, more often than not maybe downwardly mobile middle class, who I think kind of suffers from what the middle class, or this particular generation in America, has suffered from, where if you're a millennial, you're the first generation of Americans to have a lower standard of living than your parents. And if you're a Zoomer, you're the second generation. So it's just kind of this managed decline of the American empire that's been overseen by our government these last 40 years. And the consequences of that are people can't really get the stable lifetime jobs they used to be able to get. People don't really, you can't. My dad he loaded baggage for an airline, and he was able to buy a house doing that. Nobody can buy a house if they're loading baggage for an airline now. So, those kinds of jobs have disappeared. The unions have disappeared. The manufacturing jobs have all been offshored. There's not as many options. And I think a lot of people are very frustrated about that. And that frustration manifests itself in different ways. And so with WallStreetBets, they're kind of one of these communities of frustrated people who've come together and just said, oh, hey, let's bet on the stock market. We're smarter than these people. Who work in the hedge funds, we can figure it out just as well as they can. And they had kind of like a shit posting culture where they would post gains and losses. Like, people would post how much they lost or how much they gained, and you could get a lot of karma if you post that you lost like $100,000 or something ridiculous on some sort of bet. But it was like, there were a lot of people on there who were just gamblers, but there were also a lot of people who were like very smart investors and understood how the stock market worked. And it just happened with this GameStop thing that was the pinnacle of their achievements, where a few very smart users identified it, and then some institutional investors came along as well, such as the founder of Chewy.com and one of the guys from the Big Short story. The guy was played by Christian Bale in The Big Short. I forget his name. He blocked me on Twitter for whatever that's worth. But anyway, so there's a few institutional investors who got in on this, but it was just kind of like a few users who pointed it out. And then just kind of this last week is when a lot of the institutions really took notice of this, based on this huge price increase of 400% in the stock, because people were just buying and holding. And eventually there was good news with the stock, and this kind of forced it all up and forced the shorts to cover their positions.
Mm-hmm. And then what did the hedge funds lose? Because I believe one of them has gone bankrupt. Is that right?
Yeah, so Melvin Capital was kind of the one that they were most targeting. And Melvin Capital's, in terms of hedge funds, it's a smaller fish. According to Wall Street Journal, it's lost $7 billion, which is about 53% of their assets under management. Has not officially declared bankruptcy yet, but it very well might, because the thing with these hedge funds is once they, if say you invested in a hedge fund and it loses 53% of your money, you very well might want to just pull all your money out through redemptions. So a lot of these hedge funds will see, but fingers crossed, a few of them will go bust from redemptions. But Melvin Capital is kind of the main one, and then you had the bigger fish are Stephen Cohen's Point72 Asset Management, and Ken Griffin, I believe his name is the founder of Citadel. And those two hedge funds actually came together to give a $2.75 billion bailout to Melvin, the smaller one, because it had lost so much money on this trade. The estimate that I've seen was that hedge funds lost about $19.75 billion in January on GameStop and about $50 billion total on the short positions for January, though that might have been reversed since then. That was, I believe, as of last Friday. But they certainly lost a significant amount of money, and we'll see if any of them actually end up going bust over this.
Mm-hmm. So, as someone who covers Wall Street, and I think your podcast is, you say that you cover the misdeeds of billionaires. So, do you think that Wall Street is threatened by this at all?
I think they, to an extent, I think they probably feel like they've gotten this particular thing under control, but I think it represents something that scares them, and it should scare them. Because, like actually what we've seen with this talk of stimulus, Biden sending out $1,400 checks, is there's actually been a lot of open concern that people are going to use their checks to short squeeze other stocks, like, so you actually have hedge funds and Wall Street people, uh, let's say not so openly, but secretly lobbying to put more income restrictions on these checks to make sure they get into the hands of fewer people, because they're worried about this type of thing happening again. And when I say they should be concerned, one other thing I didn't mention about Wall Street Bets that I thought was very interesting, and that did fit into 4chan culture more generally, is most of the people on there were just interested in making money. However, there is a contingent of people on there and on 4chan and the internet more generally, who essentially want to burn down the system. Where I talked earlier about all these ways that the system has failed young men and women coming up. A lot of people have reacted to that by just going essentially, fuck these people, fuck these institutions. I want to see them burned down. I don't care if I lose money. I just want chaos. And that impulse, it should frighten the elites, because it does just say that whatever this particular thing was, whether or not it's over now, this sentiment is going to continue so long as these problems are just never addressed, which there's no indication that they will be in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but it does make me think of how all year we've been hearing rhetoric from the left about tearing down the system and revolution and defunding the police, and then we had the Capitol riots, the quote unquote insurrection by the Trump supporters. Now, I'm by no means a Trump supporter personally, but I can understand the anger of working people who support Trump, who are angry about a lot of things. And I don't know. There's a hypocrisy there of the elites and the politicians who have been supporting some of the rhetoric this year about like burning down the system and revolting. And then now that there's actually actions that threaten them, it's quite different, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the left in America and the United Kingdom, can't really speak for it anywhere else in the world, but I think it is a really upper class phenomenon that is essentially just going to sit on the sidelines of these very important events in American and world history. Like I've already seen on Twitter some people on the left essentially dancing on the grave of this Wall Street Bets thing because, the stock is down. People have lost a lot of money. We'll see if it comes back. But for now, it does look like the short squeeze is over. But, just people essentially dancing on the grave or blaming Reddit instead of blaming these hedge funds and Robinhood, blaming Reddit for leading people into a pump and dump scam and just not mentioning how, as I mentioned earlier, these brokerages absolutely colluded to shut down the buy side of this trade and cost retail investors probably billions of dollars. And, why is that? Well, I think it is because the left is, like I said, just a sideline player. These movements of people, and I think I agree with you. I think Trump supporters are misguided. I don't think that's going anywhere. But I think the anger that they feel is very justified, and I think it is understandable why they feel the way they feel. And so, like, you had this article come out just recently, I think in the Atlantic, which analyzed all the people arrested at the Capitol riots. And their big statistic was that 40% of them were small business owners or white collar workers. And then the left, a lot of people on the left have been trumpeting this and saying, oh, you see, they weren't poor. This was a revolt of the rich at the Capitol. Well, 40%. Okay, so that means 60% of them were not that. So the majority of them were not business owners and not white collar workers. And you just see this complete disconnect where, say, you take a protest for any given leftist issue in Seattle or Portland or wherever, you're going to find plenty of rich people there. You're probably even going to find more than that 40%. You'd have to look. But this, if it was pointed out, would be completely dismissed. And the reason is that I think the main divide in America right now, or I shouldn't say the main divide, but a very significant one, is those with college degrees and those without college degrees. This tracks very well in terms of income. Since, I believe, 1979, income for those real wages for those without college degrees is down anywhere from 12 to 24%. Whereas, with college degrees, nobody's doing great, but it's pretty flat. It's pretty level. So you have this real contraction in wages and the types of jobs people can get if they don't have degrees. And the left, as it exists now, mostly speaks to these people with degrees. And they're not going to be the agents that essentially burn down the system. It's going to be the people who don't have degrees who are dealing with this wage contraction, who are dealing with having to work for Uber or DoorDash or any of these other ridiculous apps that essentially have done away with the minimum wage, have done away with the 40-hour work week. They have people working 60 hours and all this other ridiculous stuff for like $2.30 an hour. So it is going to be this particular class of workers and people who will eventually do something to the system. And right now, I think the left is just very embittered and jealous that they are just sideline observers of whatever is eventually going to happen here in this country unless the left changes.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, tell us more about the Redditors in terms of their sense of fighting back and feeling like they're trying to take back some of this power. On your podcast, I think you said that it kind of reminds you of like, I am Spartacus, which I think was a really interesting comparison. So can you tell us more about that?
Yes, it reminds me of the modern Spartacus revolt. It got us all crucified by the side of the road on the way to Rome. But I mean, it is something where, the Spartacus revolt was a famous slave revolt against Rome, which was a slave society to a great extent. And eventually, people get fed up, they push back. And in terms of motivations for the Redditors, everybody's different, but there were a lot of stories from Wall Street Bets going around of people posting about how my dad lost his construction job after the 2008 crash. He, became a shell of his former self. He's drinking all the time now. He's not the man I once knew because, losing your job that you've had for 20 or 30 years, it takes a real toll on somebody. And just that I'm going to buy this stock and hold it to punish these people, to get back at them, to burn this all down. And, again, I think people make a real mistake when they say, oh, it didn't work, or, oh, you can't shut down the system by just buying stock. I think what is happening is that we are witnessing a class of people who are experimenting and seeing what will actually work, because they've tried street protests 500,000 times now. It doesn't do shit. They've tried rioting and smashing stuff doesn't really seem to do anything either. So, well, let's just try and squeeze a hedge fund and see if that does anything. And they're going to be just all this kind of different tactics. And I think the scary thing is that violence will escalate unless these problems are fixed. I think there's no way around that. And I think lastly, like I said, the actual culture of Wall Street bets and 4chan more generally is obviously not what anybody would describe as politically correct. So again, you have these people who are not members of, for the most part, not members of the American left, who are taking action and attempting to destroy the system and have this kind of populist revolt that the left claims to support and desire. But once again, they're just sideline critics at best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think about that whole thing about, I mean, you said so they're not PC in the slightest, which of course, and I mean, is that something that's being used to oppose them? Because I kind of see identity politics as something that does work to divide the working class and stop real challenges from being able to arise, because if the challengers are working class and they're not PC, then they're going to get a lot of flack for that. I mean, is that part of the pushback?
Oh, absolutely. Like, it took me a while to realize the full extent of this. I think I didn't even get it until after Bernie Sanders lost. I was, of course, a Bernie supporter. And I think just kind of seeing the way all this identity shit was used against him, and also seeing how his own campaign team absolutely succumbed and gave ground and lost vital constituencies. Bernie, in 2016, he won white voters without a college education in the Democratic primary. And then in 2020, he got rolled up in that demo by Joe Biden. And I think some of the rhetorical shift has a lot to do with that, because identity politics generally, the way it is practiced, is a college educated phenomenon. If we look at this dividing line, it's actually like, it's kind of the set of Victorian mannerisms where if you get a 4-year degree, you will learn how to function in this sphere. You will learn all the social codes and the little passwords and passphrases that distinguish you and allow people to understand, oh, you are in the top 20%. You are economically, you are worthy of trust, worthy of support, worthy of power. And for everybody who hasn't had the ability to take 4 years off of work and go to a university for 4 years, they don't, very rarely do they understand all these codes, do they have the time to learn them? And this is essentially used against them, because say I remember I used to work at a grocery store back when Obama was president, and I would hear my coworkers making like homophobic jokes after like a time where I was completely trained out of, never making any homophobic joke. And it wasn't that they were bad people. It was just that they didn't get the memo. They didn't spend 4 years at a public IV or whatever else. And they didn't get told like, no, you can never do this. This is violence. So say you are that person who just never got the memo and you got frustrated with the system, and somebody just looks through your Facebook or looks through your Twitter and they see that, hey, 3 years ago, you called somebody a fag or something like that, or maybe you were just joking with a friend. It doesn't matter. People just need one little piece of evidence that you are a bigot or you are this or that or you are a fascist or whatever else it may be. And once they have that little piece of evidence, and because of social media, there's so much of it, they have a huge tape to go through. Once they have that little piece of evidence, they can immediately dismiss you, immediately dismiss everything you stand for, dismiss any sort of economic concerns you might have. Just say, oh, you're only doing this because you're a fascist or because you're a white supremacist or whatever else. And so, I mean, essentially, it does just serve as a tool of ruling class power. And I think, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a great example of that, with her particular brand of identity narcissism.
Okay, so yeah, why not get into talking about AOC? Because she just told her story about the her experience when the rioters were breached the Capitol, and she's getting a lot of criticism. I mean, a lot of adulation, as she always does, but a lot of criticism too for the way she told the story. and people are accusing her of manipulating the facts and the way she told the story in order to fit a certain narrative. I mean, the narrative that she told was basically that a Capitol police officer scared her and she felt that she was in danger. But the story also kind of just, to me, seemed like he came and rescued her. And she was scared, which was totally valid, and that's fair and that's fine. But in the end, he didn't hurt her. It seemed like he directed her where to go to be safe. Anyway, all that to say, just that you know, is she what she's had this strange evolution, right? Because a lot of people, and especially, Bernie supporters and progressives, thought that she could represent real change and real economic change in the government and actually be someone who worked for the working class. I mean, did you ever have faith in her, or, were you someone who did have faith in her and then it was dashed, or what's your view on her?
Yeah, well, when she ran for her first election, I sent her $28, and I regret that more than the $500 I just lost on GameStop. Just one of the worst allocations of money in my entire life. But I thought she even like gave an interview to Glenn Greenwald when she was first running and actually made similar points to what I'm making now about identity, about how you have to have essentially a class first outlook on identity. You can't allow it to just reinforce the status quo. But hey, people get power, they change. And I think that was kind of what was unique about Bernie, was he had this actual 30-year track record, whereas a lot of these millennials and soon-to-be Zoomers, you have no idea what the fuck they're going to do when they actually get power. But what AOC has been doing in power, I think this is like, it's such a indictment of the modern left that they can't see through what is going on here. I mean, just to give you a few examples, back in 2019, AOC was having all these hearings demanding to know, or she was speaking at these hearings, demanding to know why white mass shooters were not classified as terrorists, why, this legal definition, I think it's a completely made up one, but it is a legal definition of terrorism, was not applied here. And now suddenly that they're all talking about this domestic war on terror, every single national security state Democrat wants to bring the drone war that has been so wildly successful in Afghanistan and Iraq. They want to bring it to middle America. Well, now AOC has kind of backed off that a little bit, but at the same time, she's still calling these people at the Capitol insurrectionists, which is the same thing as calling them terrorists. They were not insurrectionists. They had no plan for any sort of coup. She's foaming at the mouth with all this sort of domestic war on terror rhetoric, and I think it's extremely dangerous. She gave an interview where she said she wants Medicare for all for her children when they're her age. So she wants Medicare for all in 30 years. Are you out of your mind? Like, this is what the left is fighting for when 50,000 people plus die every year of lack of medical access, another 150,000 deaths of despair. Like, this is not a 30-year timeline we should be on. And then just to like the actual identity stuff, I think everything I said about identity being used to divide people is so embodied in what she does, because this country is 60 some percent white. So when you talk about white privilege, I think it's an extremely dangerous concept. And I don't say that. People always assume you're talking about yourself. I grew up a middle-class white kid with a dad who had a union job and was able to buy a house. I grew up perfectly fine. I'm got no problem acknowledging that I had a privileged life in the grand scheme of things. However, there are tens and tens of millions of white people in this country who do not have that life. And we don't share a common privilege. Scarlett Johansson does not share white privilege with a white guy in his 60s you see working at 7-Eleven or as a Walmart greeter or whatever job you want to pick. There's nothing in common between those two individuals. It creates this totally fake binary, and it creates this solidarity essentially between white people of different class levels that doesn't exist. No matter your race or your identity, you have more in common with your coworker of a different race or different identity than you do with a white person or a person of the same race identity was a lot of money. So she talks about white privilege. She talks about, oh, we were hiding. We went to look for like the white names of Congress people for offices to hide in during this siege. She's always pushing this ridiculous identity stuff and positioning herself as a victim, as if she didn't grow up very affluent, very well-to-do, and as if she isn't now a congressperson making six figures a year. And, just in terms of the Capitol stuff, like this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Because first of all, she wasn't in the Capitol building itself. She was, as far as we can tell, in the Cannon building, which is about a block away from the Capitol where the actual rioters were. She was in a building of offices that was not, as far as we can tell, ever breached by these rioters. So they were nowhere near her. She was never in danger. Some sort of Capitol police officer banged on her door and was trying to do his job and protect her. And, okay, great. I'm sorry that traumatized you. And I'm sorry that you had a sexual assault experience. I believe that. That's very tragic. And I feel very sorry for her. However, her entire retelling of this story was done in the most ridiculous way possible that dominated the news cycle that should have been about everything we were just talking about earlier. Like what happened to these Redditors and just these investors? As I mentioned, they lost billions of dollars because the hedge funds and the brokers colluded. That is not the kind of story that you're supposed to allow just go away. That is, hey, let's have hearings, let's hold these hedge funds accountable, let's bust them up, and let's not take the pressure off until that is done. AOC has no sense of being a public servant whatsoever. She is out there for her own book. She's going to publish her memoir and make, $5 or $10 million doing so, because all she can ever talk about is herself and her own experiences. And she knows the massive, massive media profile that she has. And she just uses it to talk about herself, to talk about this ridiculous story where a Capitol police officer traumatized her when she was in no danger whatsoever. There's no evidence that these rioters had any plans to kill her or any other congressperson for that matter. This has only ever been asserted by the FBI and federal prosecutors. And she's repeating this ridiculous story. And then Ted Cruz, the Republican senator, quote tweets her original tweet about the Wall Street stuff and says, I agree, let's do something. And as a politician, what you should do there is call his bluff. Say, hey, I will call your office. Let's put out a bill. And then if he doesn't respond, you update the public. Instead, she quote tweets him and says that his insistence that the elections were fraudulent or whatever had led to an assassination attempt against her, essentially that he tried to murder her. This is such ridiculous exaggeration. As we mentioned, the rioters were nowhere near her offices. She was never in any danger. The only person she was hiding from was a police officer attempting to protect her. And she essentially accuses another senator of attempting to assassinate her. And that is, of course, going to poison the well. It's going to poison the well of anything ever happening, anything ever changing. And that is what she exists to do. She exists to fuel partisanship, because the entire purpose, the entire strategy for maintaining the status quo as it exists now is to convince the people who vote Republican and the people who vote Democrat that the voters for the other party are the enemy, when the actual enemy is this very small, very elite, permanent group at the top, both Republican and Democrat, what is sometimes called the deep state. And they just want to keep you all screaming at each other instead of coming together and saying, okay, we might not agree on everything, but hey, we all agree these hedge funds are fucking criminals. Let's put them in jail. Let's shut them down. You could get Republicans and Democrats, you could get 60 to 70% of the country all on board if you said, we'll figure all this other stuff out later, but we're going to deal with Wall Street first. And the role of people like AOC, and she does have equivalents on the right, but the role of people like her is to make sure that that never happens and that no such coalition with the other side is possible, and that the left remains this small little 20% of the population elite phenomenon.
Yeah, I was listening to a Glenn Greenwald interview recently where he talked about, I think it was on Jimmy Dore. So they were talking all about AOC. And he said, AOC, you were here to not to be partisan, not to be Democrats versus Republicans, but to be the Justice Democrats, which is what her coalition was called. And they were supposed to be different from the other Democrats. And a lot of people really believed that. I mean, I knew a lot of people who put a lot of faith into the Justice Democrats because they believed that if they got into Congress, they would actually challenge the status quo and that they wouldn't just spend their time, I guess, just screaming at Republicans. And like you said, fomenting this idea that it's Democrats versus Republicans, which I agree is a bit of a distraction. And I guess, okay, I have a question for you. What would you do if you were a politician to Wall Street? You mentioned throwing them in jail. What would you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's any number of things like, in my ideal world, you would essentially nationalize every investment bank, most every hedge fund, but probably that would never happen. So I think the thing suggested by Matt Taibbi that I think is the most reasonable demand that everybody can rally around is end too big to fail. There should not be any institution that is so big that if it collapsed, it would require a bailout. So you do that you can do it legally, you can put a tax on them. There was a suggestion from a Republican congressman who retired, and of course it was shot down by the banking industry, but he suggested just putting a X percentage tax on every too big to fail institution, because all these institutions essentially get free insurance from the government, because everybody knows that Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase and a few others, they can never go bankrupt because the entire economy would explode. So everybody prices in that the government is always going to bail them out. The government has to bail them out. So they get free insurance for their business model. And the idea of the tax is to essentially charge them for that free insurance, or you could even step it up to the point where they would have to sell off assets and split off and create smaller financial institutions that are much more manageable and that can actually be allowed to fail, because you don't have any sort of market competition right now in finance. We have like the worst of the American system and the worst of the Soviet system, where you have these government-backed institutions that privatize all the profits, as opposed to just having the government run the financial system. You have the worst possible combination. So I think the key is to break up too big to fail in some form or another. And then there's a number of other reforms. I look often to what was done in the New Deal. I think, a lot of Americans don't understand this country 80 years ago, the Senate voted for a 30-hour work week. You just imagine that happening today. This country has gotten extremely more reactionary on economic issues. It used to have 33% union density in the private sector. It's now down to like 6 or 7%. So I think just hearkening back to that period is the best place to start. And then once we're like back to where we were in 1936, then we can proceed into what we're going to do in the future.
And I want to go back a little bit to the Redditors and the concept of holding, because you did mention this. And I wonder if you would be okay with talking a little bit about your own investment, your own stocks. You said you lost money. Do you mind telling us about it?
Yes, I finally threw in the towel and I sold today. I feel bad about it, but one of the original users of the Reddit, the user called Deep Fucking Value, said that he's going to stop posting his daily updates. So, I mean, this is probably the end of the party. I hope it goes up. I know people are still facing significant exposure to this. I bought last week 3 shares for about $800, ended up losing $500. You know what though? I look at it as an investment in the podcast. I lost money as a bit to show my listeners how stupid I am. So I hope they get $500 worth of entertainment out of my own gambling. But I bought it on Monday last week. And then what I should have done if I was smart is I should have sold it on the Thursday, where they shut down all that buy side trading. I would have doubled my money, and that would have been the smart thing to do, because I think the lesson for me and for others in the future is, once you're in a market or anywhere and you see that the thumb is on the scale for the other side, just get the fuck out immediately. I held through to today because I kind of wanted to see what happened, and I was hoping. I would have, you mentioned holding, I would have felt bad also, just like getting out. And that's what was so interesting about this, because again, what the left claims is their entire idea is solidarity. And I think it is a fair criticism that stock market speculation is incompatible with solidarity. But they were trying. And at heart, a cynic, but at the same time, I seem to be very optimistic every time a protest movement comes around, and I allow myself to fall in love again and again, because I did have this idea that if retail investors could show solidarity, they could actually make this squeeze happen. But just the way the stock market is set up, your profit is somebody else's loss. You're always trying to pump your bags onto somebody else. I don't think there's any real plan for solidarity here. So I did sort of allow myself to be deceived there, but I do think it is interesting to see all these people who, again, are not of the left, who are very much talking of solidarity and very much believing in the idea and very much investing a lot of their futures into this. So I do hope the stock goes back up, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, from my brief browsing of the WallStreetBets forum, there was a real feeling of solidarity there. The whole thing, it was like people were posting all these gifts from war movies, and it was like, hold. And I can see where that would be really moving and really, I mean, I think it was, that's why this story has exploded so much beyond people who just care about stocks, or even beyond people who just care about politics, because people could sense that solidarity. And your Spartacus analogy kind of made me think of that as well, in the way in Spartacus they all had to stand up and say, I am Spartacus, in order to protect that first person. Just kind of struck me from the WallStreetBets that there was a real sense of camaraderie, I think.
No, absolutely. And, I think we'll see if it lasts. I think some people who did lose money will be pretty disillusioned, but I think it's sort of a question of what the government's actually going to do now. The SEC has been talking about cracking down on these Reddit investors, which, again, it's just so ridiculous that everything we mentioned with the hedge funds and the brokers, I want to see an investigation there. I want to see if there was any coordination. I want to see who made what phone calls and sent what emails, and everything that happened leading up to that decision to shut down the buy side on Thursday. But if the investigation is just focusing on the Redditors, I think that we'll continue to just pile on all this anger at the government. So people might say, okay, we're not going to be able to do solidarity on a stock speculation, but they might coordinate in other ways. And the remnants of the WallStreetBets and the people who lost money and are frustrated and in some cases desperate, they might turn to other alternatives, and they might coordinate in other ways, and they might look at other ways of impacting or even just damaging the system any way that they can.
Interesting. Well, Sean, where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter at SeanMcCarthyCom. You can read me every day talking about how much I hate AOC and how she voted for Nancy Pelosi for speaker without getting anything for it whatsoever. I'm also at SeanPMcCarthy.com, my website. I'm going to update it soon. It's a little out of date. And my podcast is Grubstakers, SoundCloud.com/Grubstakers. We're also on Patreon. We usually give kind of biographies and the misdeeds of various billionaires we profile. Right now, we're doing 2 episodes a month on the SoundCloud and 4 a month on the Patreon. But if you're interested in learning about billionaires and how people made their money, I think it's a pretty worthwhile podcast.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on and for explaining everything and giving your view of the situation.
Thanks for having me. A lot of fun.